Welcome, everybody, to the Season 1 finale of Unleashed, the fastest hour on the internet, I promise, where we're bringing world-class thought leaders live to your living rooms and home offices every Thursday, just like we've been doing through the whole pandemic. I'm your host, of course, Jeff Tetz. I'm the CEO of Results. And at Results, we believe the biggest challenge for businesses is execution. Our team helps leaders execute better to dramatically change their results. Staff that care, teams that deliver, clients who love and refer you. That's what we all want. And that's also what this show Unleashed is all about. We just want to provide you with tools and ideas from interesting people that you can apply to your life and into your leadership capabilities immediately. And thank you so much to everyone that is joining us today and that has joined us throughout Season 1. This show is really designed for anybody that has a growth mindset, no matter what position that you hold, what you do for a living, or where you live. This is for you. And we're going to try something that I hope is going to be fun today. And I came across a really interesting video that inspired me earlier in the week. And of all things, it was an acceptance speech that Mr. Rogers gave at the Emmys in the early 80s. And during his acceptance speech, he's holding his Emmy in one hand and the microphone in the other. And he asks an auditorium filled with celebrities to pause for 20 seconds and just think about the people that made a difference in their lives. And it's a really, really compelling, heartfelt, touching video. And so what we're going to do today is we're giving away copies of Tim Arnold's book, of course, The Power of Healthy Tension. And what we're going to do is, for anybody that goes on social media and recognizes somebody that has made a difference in their own personal life, using the hashtag Results Unleashed, you're going to get an entry form into the draw to win a copy of Tim's book. So we'll see how we go there. We'll get all those recognitions going. And regardless of the book draw and the giveaway, you'll have a chance to really make a heartfelt difference in somebody's life right now that made a difference in yours. So get those recognitions and those posts going when the show is over. And also, when the show is over, make sure that you give us some feedback. So click the Leave Meaning button and then click the Continue button, which takes you right to the survey. And throughout the show, as questions come up with, and when inevitably they do, please enter them into the Q&A box. And I'm going to get to as many of your questions for Tim Arnold as I possibly can. If you have other feedback, other thoughts, other comments to share with us, you can email us anytime at info@unleashresults.com. And then with summer on the horizon, it might be a good time to get trained up. And we've got a couple of workshops today, and I'll talk about those more at the end of the show. So Tim Arnold is graciously offering up some of his workshop time to dive deeper into his unbelievable topic. And Results is also offering a Leaders Toolkit 4-part series. You might want to check that out. Now, on with today's show. So I am delighted to be joined by special guest Tim Arnold, and I think this is a topic that is absolutely going to blow your mind, as it did for mine. Now, Tim Arnold has spent over 2 decades helping organizations unite teams, spark change, and get unstuck with clients that include the United Nations, Citibank, KPMG, Toyota, Siemens, and others. Drawing on his experiences launching successful businesses, social enterprises, and community development programs, Tim brings a real-world perspective to his clients. He has advanced degrees in both business and social justice. That's interesting. And he's able to help organizations pursue both profit and purpose. Not easy to put together sometimes. Arnold is also the author of a best-selling book, The Power of Healthy Tension, which we're giving away today, Overcoming Chronic Issues and Conflicting Values. And beyond leadership and team development, Tim is an avid outdoorsman, world traveler, and a self-proclaimed really bad hockey player. His biggest accomplishments are being dad to Declan and Avril, and of course, husband to Becky. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
So I think that this episode is really going to be a paradigm shift for people. Now, this notion of healthy tension is not something I'd heard before, and our event coordinator and social media manager, Anne, made me aware of you and what your topic was, and she just couldn't stop talking about it after she saw you speak, I think, in Calgary. And as I dove into it, it just made so much sense, and I thought, geez, why have I not seen this before? And so many things seem to be polarizing these days, right or wrong, yes or no, whether it be politics, religion, diet and nutrition even. We seem to have this tendency to dig our heels into one side or the other. And we can't really find redeeming qualities about people or ideas who don't fit the side that we choose. So you either love or you hate, you support or you denounce a political leader, for example. And there's sort of this cancel culture that we've created. And I think even on a smaller scale, I was telling you before that on just this previous Saturday, I think I may have experienced what you mean by healthy tension. A good friend of mine wanted to get together for a walk and a picnic. And on Saturdays, I have a bit of a personal routine that I go through, and I don't like anyone or anything to interfere with that routine unless it's inclement weather. And I was really torn between wanting to stick to my routine and my structure, but then also being free-spirited and spontaneous. So Tim, can you share with us, first of all, is what I experienced example of what you talk about? And then can you, on a larger scale, can you just share the concept of what healthy tension is?
Sure. I do think it's what I'm talking about. I think that you were having to deal with both flexibility and structure, which every leader deals with every day. More on a personal level, I think you were having to manage the tension of kind of taking care of others, but also not neglecting to take care of yourself. So there's a lot of tensions that you're managing. You may not have heard of this concept, healthy tension.
Yeah.
You know it though. You live this every day. And if you're in a leadership space, it's something that you experience constantly. Probably the best way for me to explain is to start by explaining what we're not talking about. What we're not talking about today is the idea of problem solving. You know, research would suggest in North America, leaders solve 200 to 300 problems a day. And you wouldn't get very far in the day without being able to do that. You know, problem solving is when you're dealing with a challenge and there's generally a right or a wrong answer, or maybe a lot of options, but there's a best answer. You can choose that answer and you're done. And we're conditioned to be problem solvers our entire life. You know, before we can walk or talk, you know, we're brought home from the hospital and we're taught what's safe and unsafe. You know, so we learn that. Well, then we move on a little bit and we're quickly taught in school that for most questions, there's a correct and an incorrect answer. And if I get the correct answer, I may get the gold star. But if I get the wrong answer, you know, I might get that dreaded red or that horrible X, right? Well, then in our teenage years, our families, our communities really work on morals and values. And we're taught that in life, there's good and bad paths. And if I can just take the right path, I'm a good person. Yeah. So what happens is we enter the workplace, and if we choose the path of leadership, whether we've thought about it or not, we've pretty much lived with the worldview that for every challenge that comes my way, if I can just choose the right answer, I'm done. I'm safe, I'm correct, and I'm a good person. Right. And I want to be clear, problem solving is critical. As I said, you wouldn't make it to lunch today if you weren't able to hold on to that skill set. I'm also going to say with quite a bit of confidence, it's incomplete. There's a whole other level of leadership, of team effectiveness, of organizational effectiveness that goes beyond problem solving and ultimately gets into our conversation today when we have to learn to wrestle with tensions that aren't going away, you know, tensions to manage. And, you know, problem solving takes what's called either or thinking. It's this or it's this. It's good or it's bad. It's right or it's wrong. Tensions are actually right and right. It takes what's called both and thinking. Yeah. And I mean, there's lots of research and literature around this. Sometimes they're referred to as paradoxes, dilemmas, polarities, wicked problems. Call it what you want, but they're ongoing issues that you face. They're not going to go away, but the real kind of mark of your effectiveness as a leader or your organization is, can we allow that tension to be healthy, or is it going to be something that constantly is chronic in my leadership or in our organization? Is it possible that we embrace what I call healthy tension? And Jeff, you and I chatted a little bit before the call today. I've done quite a bit of research on this in a lot of different countries. Most people assume tension is a bad thing. You know, to the point I've literally said, I say tension, you think what? And I've got long lists of words like headache and shoulder pain and conflict and, you know, toxic, all of which could be true. But what I want our group today to just open their minds to is that there's a whole other side to tension that may just be the very thing that's holding you back in your leadership. Yeah. Instead of what most people do, which is to avoid tension or ignore it, The most effective thing you can do as a leader is the opposite: embrace it and recognize this can be the best thing for me and for our organization.
Yeah, and Tim, I might be getting ahead of ourselves here in the conversation, but how do you know the difference between when it's a problem to solve, a decision to make, or and versus a tension to embrace?
Sure. Well, there's lots of criteria, but I'll give you some real simple ones.
Yeah,
If it's a problem to solve, you can come up with either the right answer or the best answer, and you're done. You walk away. Maybe you can look back and say, hey, I maybe could have come up with a better answer, but you've solved it. You can move on. Tensions are ongoing. I'd almost have you think of breathing. I can't wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I think it's an inhale day today. I can, it just won't last very long. The only effective thing that I can do to really embrace life is to learn to hold that inhaling and exhaling intention. It's ongoing. It's not going away. And for some people, including myself, I have an undergrad in accounting. I like right answers. I like being done with things.
yeah,
But tensions you got to get comfortable with. Now, you often also can recognize a tension because, in my book, I say they're often chronic, in that, you're in a team meeting, whether you're at a boardroom or a Zoom room, and someone says something, and in the back of your mind, you're like, are we actually talking about this again? It's one of those things that it just feels like it's ongoing, which is a really good indicator. You know what? There's probably a good reason that we are talking about this, because this is a foundational tension for us to manage well. And again, rather than ignoring it or, assuming we're doing something wrong, let's lean into it.
yeah. You now you've got a surfing story, I think that really highlights and illustrates how this works in real life. Why don't you share that with us?
Absolutely. Well, this is going back a number of years, but when I was really starting to dig into this research, and it was really, kind of taking up a lot of my thought and work, I 10 years after my undergrad, my university dorm mates, we reunited in Southern California for a week of surf school. So we were convinced and we were guaranteed that at the end of the week, we'd all be surfing. The picture of what that looked like was very different than what I anticipated. It was a great week, though. What was fascinating was that the very first morning of surf school, our instructor wouldn't let us go in the water until we answered a question. And he had us stand right at the shore. He said, okay, you know how this works, right? He looked out into the ocean. He said, you're going to go against the waves, until you find a good one, and then you're going to ride it in. Of course, we're nodding our head. And it's like, but here's the question. If the waves generally are always bringing water into shore, how does the water get back out? And, we all looked at each other, and he goes, like, again, think about it. He says, if your gut tells you the waves bring water in, where does it go? And long story short, what he was trying to get us to recognize is this concept of a riptide or a rip current. And, I had heard of it. I just didn't really know what it was. And what I learned was, conventional wisdom or your gut says, yeah, waves bring water in. But what I wasn't aware of was that water generally formed and eddied along the shore. It formed this river called a riptide that flowed perpendicular to shore, right out into the ocean. And, he said, the reason we're telling you this, and it happened to me once, it was just like he explained. He says, if you go into a riptide, it's going to go against everything you're familiar with. And, I remember once I was paddling out, I lifted my head. I was 3 times further out than I thought I would be. And everything he said came true to me. He goes, everything in you is going to want to just paddle like heck to shore. But he said, don't do it, because you can't beat a riptide. And in fact, the harder you paddle towards where you want to go, the further you're going to go in the opposite direction. So, my goal that week was avoid riptides. Well, what I noticed, though, as day 2 and day 3 approached, is that every morning the legit surfers, the real surfers, they'd show up and they'd study the water as well. But unlike me, they weren't looking for the riptides to avoid them. They were looking at the riptides to ride them out. They took something that I feared and they leveraged it to their advantage. They would take a riptide, ride it out, be on their 4th or 5th wave by the time I was on my 1st. And like the big idea that I talk about a little bit more in the book is, as leaders, we're dealing with kind of 2 realities or 2 undercurrents as well. As I said earlier, we have to solve problems every day, hundreds of times a day. And in some ways, those are like the waves that come in. We get it. We know how they look. We know how they feel. And as a result, it's our gut, right? Well, there's also this other undercurrent that we're going to spend a bit more time digging into, and that's these tensions to manage. and they're different. If I'm dealing with the tension, I have to have different types of conversations. I have to think about the challenge differently. And unfortunately, because it's not what I'm used to, most leaders avoid them at all costs.
Yeah,
They just try to avoid them. What's interesting, and there's just so much evidence and research to back this up, like the surfers, the leaders in the organizations that outperform and enjoy life way more are the ones that learn to leverage them. To say, hey, we're going to keep solving problems every day, and we're also going to tap into some of this power that comes from tension management. And, as I said, you may not even know that term, but you're already dealing with them. The question is, are you tapping into what they can offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that the surfing analogy is so appropriate. I think most of us have seen that quote that, you can't control the waves, but you have to learn how to surf. And that's what we've been having to do collectively now for at least 4 months. So before we move on, I know you have a four-step system that you have developed and a framework. But my most important question is, did you actually get the courage up to ride a riptide?
So I was in a riptide, and I experienced the downside. By the end of the week, I wasn't that brave. I was, and it's still got to be something I work towards. But
yeah, it sounds absolutely terrifying. As we're moving into your four-step framework, Tim, how did you discover this in the first place? Because it's just something I have never come across this before, and I like to think of myself as a fairly aware, avid reader. And I had never come across this before. How did you discover this?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, I was raised very much not with this kind of worldview. I was raised pretty binary, very kind of either or, black or white, pretty fundamentalist family upbringing, great upbringing, but very, it's right or it's wrong, or it's good or it's bad. And when I was actually just getting into the early years of consulting, one of the big banks in Canada wanted me to do a number of programs, but they really wanted me to integrate this framework from Dr. Barry Johnson called polarity management. So, what that meant is I had to get equipped in that pretty quickly. So, I mean, Barry's become probably the biggest mentor in my life, but that meant I immediately went to get trained in this. And it was the first, and again, there's lots of different frameworks around this, but it was the first time that I came face to face that there are unsolvable problems there. And not only do they exist, I've got so many of them in my life, I've just never named them. I've never been comfortable with the fact that it's okay that this isn't either or. And it's okay that some things, the worst thing I can do is pick a side. What I want to do is actually hold things in balance and tension. That was a completely, it's funny because I went to get trained in this framework, but probably the very first day of getting introduced to this, I recognized at a heart level, listen, because this is big. And I mean, it's been life-changing for me. I mean, it's resulted in all of my research, career, writing, kind of focusing on this. What's interesting, Jeff, is that I work with leaders of all sorts in all corners of the world. Rarely do I come across a leader who's poor at problem solving.
Yeah.
But we're very underdeveloped in our ability to recognize and manage tensions well. And when you see someone, again, whether they call it healthy tension or not, if you see someone that, again, solves problems well, but they also can identify and make tension safe to lean into, like a riptide, to ride and leverage, they stand out from the pack.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, even just liberating the conversation that those tensions exist. I've already been thinking about all of the times where I have that conflict and I don't mention it to the person I'm having it with as an example, why I'm torn between one thing or another, one action or this action. And so I can already see how that would start to enhance cohesiveness, trust, collaboration, communication.
Well, sure. And you're feeling it already. And I should say, this isn't just a work thing. My partner, Becky, and I, when it comes to parenting, I hang out pretty hard on the structure side. I'm married to someone who naturally has a disposition towards flexibility. That can result in lots of conflict. Yeah. It also can result in really effective parenting when we get beyond choosing sides and say, how do those things live together? Yeah. Because you know what? As a parent, if I get my structured way all the time, no one wins. Certainly not my kids.
Yeah.
But if I lose this and say, okay, we'll just jump on the other side, it's a lose-lose.
Yeah.
So they show up in all elements of life. And, whether I was in organizations working or working with organizations, there's always a short list of one or two that, you may not have named it, but as soon as you name it, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, we wrestle with that all the time.
Absolutely. So if the audience is anything like me at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, this makes sense. I have experienced this before. I didn't know what it was, but now that I'm getting a sense for that, how do I actually start to ride the waves and use the riptides to my advantage? So I know we have a visual on your your 4-part framework. Let's bring that up. And I also want to remind everybody tuning in right now to get your questions in for Tim. So if you have some questions, no such thing as a silly question, put them in the Q&A box, and which is different than the chat box. And I'll get to as many of your questions as I can throughout the remainder of the episode.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would say, I hope in an encouraging way, is to determine that you're going to be a leader, or your organization is going to, instead of ignoring or avoiding tension, embrace. There's really simple ways you can do it. And, I talk about 4 things that help. The nice thing is you don't even have to do all 4. Just pick one. It will make a difference. And probably it would, in our time today, be worth at least talking about the first 2 steps.
Yeah.
If you did nothing beyond the first step, I guarantee you it will make a quick and significant difference. And, I mentioned the term identify your crux tension.
Yeah.
And, anyone who's tuning in today, I'd say, think about not just what I'm saying, but how does that apply to you? Because it does. I guarantee it. Crux tension is actually, I'm pulling from a rock climbing term. So for anyone who's rock climbed before, if you go to a good climbing area anywhere in the world, generally you research it ahead of time. And once you're there, you've identified 1 or 2 climbs that you just got to try. So you've made it to that climb because there's lots of local climbers around. So you go up to a climber and you say, okay, I'm going to try this. What's the crux move? Generally, what that means is, between where I'm standing on the ground and where I want to go, maybe 100 feet in the air, there's a lot of moves I have to make. Hand holds, foot holds, body movements. But there's probably only 1 or 2 that really matter. And if you can point that out to me, and I can just put all my energy and my focus into that crux move,
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about the rest. And it works. What's really cool is the exact same phenomenon or idea is true with tensions. You'd be quite taken back if I showed you a bit of research behind the list of tensions you're already managing as a leader. It's long. I mean, there's, I would say at least 50. You may not have named them, but you're managing them. And it's not helpful for me to just give you that list and say, good luck. And 2 things. 1, you wouldn't be listening today if you weren't doing okay at it.
Yeah.
But I'll say this, out of that list of 30, 40, 50 tensions that you're managing, there's probably only 1 or 2 that are make it or break it for you. Meaning that, and it doesn't mean you're necessarily managing it poorly or well. It just means that, there's not a day goes by that we're not wrestling with this on some level.
Yeah.
And it's at all types of organizations. I worked with the United Nations for a number of years, and, we had 55 nation states in the room, and constantly we had to be mindful of the fact we're here for centralized coordination. I worked with nuclear, so it was around safeguards and nuclear rules. But centralized coordination will never work if we don't also address decentralized freedom. You had countries like Canada saying, hey, we want centralized coordination, but we also want freedom to use nuclear for medicine and for energy. Well, that either is going to be, and again, that room felt that tension every single time they were together. Yeah. But once we named it and said, gang, this isn't going away. So we're either going to let this centralized, decentralized tension divide us, or we're going to actually say, no, it's not either or, it's both and we're going to work hard to manage this tension well.
Yeah, boy, that's powerful, Tim. Yeah, I mean, I'm even relating it back to, we're in the middle right now of our own leadership team meeting for our 3 to 5 year strategic planning. We did day 1 yesterday, and having this discussion about innovation and discomfort versus measuring things and structure. And it's they're not easy to navigate, but if you name them and get them out on the table, I already feel a bit of a sense of relief.
Well, and what's interesting is, there's a few, we even say strategic planning. I can say, I hope that you as a group were saying, gang, let's realize that there's a few things at play right now. We got to look at short-term and long-term, and both of those have to be honored, or this will work. It's like inhaling and holding it. It's going to not work long-term. We want to talk about certainly structure around this plan, but what are we going to do to allow for the flexibility that's needed for the next pandemic or for the next whatever? And it's not that we have to pick sides. If we really want to, it's interesting. Jim Collins in Good to Great talked a lot about the same concept. And he said, organizations that outperform everyone around them, and in his work, it was for 50 years or more, generally have learned to embrace the genius of the and. They stop getting caught up in the tyranny of the or, believing that everything is binary, everything we have to pick a side. And it started with leaders. They made it safe for their organization to say, no, it's not one or the other. We're going to live in this place of healthy tension.
Yeah. So Tim, you've worked with, thousands of companies and thousands of leaders. What are some of the more, I guess, common tensions that you come across?
Sure. And I'll go through a few with you. I will say though, language matters. So the way that I would name a tension may not work for you, but it's probably in the same ballpark. You're like, oh yeah, I get that, but we call it this. Know that language does matter. But I do have a list. I've got a short list of 10 that I would say in almost every organization I worked with, whether it was a tech startup, a hospital, a not-for-profit, some manifestation of these show up. Planning and execution, focus on part, focus on the whole. Right now it's an interesting one with social distancing. A lot of us are super task focused, but how are we also maintaining relationships? Another one, and we'll talk probably about this later, but in the COVID reality, everyone's talking about their pivot strategy. How am I changing? How am I innovating? And I would say yes. And what are you holding on to at all costs? What are you going to make sure 2 years from now, you're not going to look back and say, oh man, we lost that. Change and stability. This is just a list that I'd say, again, maybe not the exact words you'd use, but I bet you get these, and even out of this list, Jeff, I'd say, don't worry then about 10 of them, pick one or two and make that common language in your teams to say, gang, the fact that we're feeling this is not a bad thing. I ran a team for 10 years. And once we shortlisted, the couple of tensions that we felt were our crux tensions, we actually, made it common language. We were at a point where I would even say to new staff in orientation, you won't work a shift and not feel this. And it's a good thing. In fact, if we're not feeling these tensions, someone else should be doing this work.
Right.
Like this is the business we're in. So don't get excited about picking a side, because that's the worst thing we could do.
Yeah. There's a question from Derek that came in, Tim, and it's a really important one. And the concept being very timely, Derek says, in today's political and social context, but how do we apply this beyond just our own organization?
Well, wow, we could spend probably 4 or 5 more hours on that. I would say this, there's so much kind of science and even psychology behind why we struggle to manage tension. And I don't want to open up a can of worms I can't close. I would say a few things though. I already talked about the fact that we're conditioned to be problem solvers, which means we're raised to think that there's a right and wrong answer to most things, when in fact, that is the case in certain circumstances, policies, rules, procedures, history. But there's so many other complexities that we have to recognize. And it's a level of maturity, right? Where we're saying, yeah, that's not a problem to solve. That's a tension to manage. And I got to get comfortable with that. Yeah. The other thing that makes this really complex, and I'm sure lots of your, gang today that's listening in has heard of this term confirmation bias. Yeah. Sometimes in Chris Argyris's work in the fifth discipline, or I got my books confused, but it's called the reflexive loop. The idea is, as humans, once we have beliefs or biases, we look for things to affirm those beliefs. So, let's get political. Once I'm maybe on the political right or political left, I'm probably going to read news sources and watch news feeds that affirm those biases. Yeah. Which means that I get more and more convinced of my point of view. And because I've been raised to be a problem solver, if someone has the point of view on the other side, I have to only assume that they're wrong. So my goal is to pull them to my side instead of saying, is it possible that this isn't right or wrong? This is right or right.
Yeah.
That there's truth on both sides.
Yeah.
And, and right now, I mean, I literally this morning was going through some research on, in the last 20 years, in North America specifically, how the percentage of which our culture has moved towards more binary thinking as opposed to less. Yeah. Meaning that significantly we've shifted towards believing in any tension, there's a right side. Yeah. And again, in some ways that's pretty discouraging. The really cool thing is, if you are brave enough to be in the few that says, no way, with some of, now again, I want to be clear, there's still right and wrong, and there's still good and bad. In other situations, though, there's right and right. And we refuse to just ignore the complexity. Instead, we're going to embrace it. We're going to be a leader. We're going to be a person. I'm going to be an individual who's able to hold things in tension and not just find a tribe of people who affirm my beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. I came across an article last week, and I think we put it actually up on our social platforms yesterday. I think it was posted to the results Twitter account. And it was the research says that if you're trying to bring somebody over to see your side of the argument, the more logic that you use and the stats that you use about your side of the argument, the less likely you are to sway them, because they already know that information, and it only strengthens their resolve and their existing beliefs. So if we want to try to find some kind of middle ground, we have to speak in each other's language, using each other's value speak. Do you have any commentary on that, Tim?
Yeah, I talk a little bit, I think, about what you're referring to, and the language that I use is, it's called a tug-of-war conversation.
Yeah.
And, if you remember, Jeff, back to the days of tug-of-war, generally the only goal is to get the other side to your side. That's it. So what happens is, if they pull, you pull harder. And, we do this when we're having different points of view. Maybe, I'll go back to the home situation. I'm feeling we need more structure and consistency at home. My partner Becky feels, no, we need a bit more flexibility and individuality. So I explained to her kind of where I'm coming from and how she needs to get there. But I can tell you from experience, and I can give you a lot of research to back it up, the more I just explain my point of view and the downside of hers, and I think I'm getting her to come to my side, but I'm actually getting her pushing farther the opposite way.
Yeah.
As opposed to having curiosity. And again, the interesting thing is, we're talking about leaders who can manage the tension of being both confident and humble.
Yeah.
Confident to say, hey, here's what I see, here's what I believe, here's what I want to hold on to. Humble to know, and I'm always missing something. And I know that through this conversation, we're both going to see it clearer. And, that confidence and humility really comes from embracing curiosity. And it's one of the things, I have this rare opportunity to be in so many organizations. Curiosity is a rare thing. Confidence isn't. Folks can be super confident, but to be really curious, it's a competitive advantage.
Yeah. The question comes in from Lisa. Thanks for joining us today, Lisa. What do you do with people's tensions when the perspectives are just so different and one side has no self-awareness or humility? So the language adaptation and effort just is not going to work.
Yes. Yeah, I'm thinking of folks who, I'll do a workshop and someone's like, this is great, but you don't know who I work with. And I get that. I will say this. If you start with yourself and look for, even if their position, you'd say, no, I actually think that's wrong, but look at what are the interests that they're fighting for. Because a lot of times positions are based in sometimes confidence, sometimes fear. So what are they fighting for? And be curious to, again, not give up where you're coming from, but to say, hey, where's that coming from? I hear you're saying that you really want this, but what's the interest behind it? You would be shocked at the openness that people that you thought were absolutely brick wall, wouldn't budge, will have if they truly feel listened to, and they truly feel, not in a manipulative way, but they authentically feel you're trying to understand their point of view.
Yeah.
People don't have to get their way so long as they truly believe that their way is being heard and trying to be factored into decision making. Now, I know that there are people who don't fit that description, I'll tell you from my experience, they're by far the minority.
Yeah.
Well, people will often, I've seen this in coaching as well, folks that are just so kind of foot in the sand, I'm not moving. They feel like, wow, they're listening to me. They're trying to integrate this. They're willing to kind of rise to a different level of conversation. So the good news is, if you're a leader, you're a person who's saying, no, I'm going to really try to hold on to some of these principles of inviting people into tension. You'd be pretty shocked at the people who will take you up on that offer.
Yeah. I know that there's a fatal mistake that I think a person can make in those kinds of conversations, in that it's rushing to an assumption of what the other side values. And I have made that mistake so many times. And rather than inquiring and asking good questions to confirm exactly what they value and not have to guess and assume, are there some questions that you have found that might work, or some approaches to confirming that work better than others?
Yeah, there's a few things that I think are really, really helpful. I feel, if I sense myself getting into a little bit of a tug-of-war conversation, and I have a really close associate, we work together constantly on kind of where the business is going. I'm very much, a crux tension for us is the tension of change and stability. And I'm very biased towards change. I get excited about it. Our website would be different every week if I was allowed. That works for me. My colleague Claudia would be pretty solid on the stability side. And, when I get fired up about an idea, often, when I'm throwing it to her, what I sense immediately is kind of the tug of war resistance, which can, in some ways be a downer for me. I'm like, oh, she doesn't get it. But what I've learned to do, and it often feels mechanical and it becomes natural.
Yeah.
Is if I'm sensing all of a sudden, wow, we're in a bit of a tug of war, there's a couple things that I'm going to try to discipline myself to do. One is to authentically affirm her values. So it's like, Claudia, as we're in this, first of all, I know that ultimately, if we don't stay the course with X, Y, and Z, no one's going to even know what we offer. And we're not going to be good at anything.
Yeah.
I also know, and here, Jeff, if you just do this, it's pretty game changing.
Okay.
I acknowledge the downside of my bias if I get my way all the time. So I'll say, and I also know, Claudia, that if we do this and everything else, this business is going to fall. I know that, because what that does, it lets the other person recognize, oh, they assume you didn't know that. It's like, I know that. So there's a bit of I'm not trying to just pull you to my side. Then you have the opportunity to say, and, not but, and is the bridge building word.
Yep.
How do these two things live together? So how might we move forward with this opportunity, but in a way that doesn't explore that kind of downside of overdone change and ignore those values of stability that you see clearly and ultimately I want? How do we do that?
Yeah.
And the normal tug of war is I just tell Claudia why she's overdone stability and why change is great. And as you say, all I've done is pushed her farther the other way. But if I can start by affirming what she values, and again, this has to be authentic. If this is a manipulative approach, forget it. But it's like, Claudia, and sometimes I'll even say, help me understand what you're pulling towards right now. I need to see that. And I want you to know, if I get my way around this all the time, we're in trouble. I get that.
Yeah.
Well, now all of a sudden we're having a bit of a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's helpful, Tim. Very, very helpful. And
I mean, if people want to put this to the test,
yeah,
try it offline in the wild around politics. If you're from the right or from the left, the easy thing to do is believe that it's binary, that one side's right, one side's wrong. Rise above that. And even with someone who is quite polarized from your point of view, look at what changes when you try to understand the values that they care about, and also acknowledge the downside if your side gets its way all the time.
Yeah.
It will change the conversation.
Wow, that is so helpful and so powerful. So not just building better relationships with people that but I think we've also just been handed the secrets to having good Twitter debates. So thank you for that, Tim.
Well, I'm not convinced Twitter's the best way to do it, but I'll let you decide on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was chuckling because I think in some ways you described a similar relationship that I have with our show producer, Andrea. So she's probably laughing behind the scenes as well. I can only imagine our conversation later today. The other thing that I wanted to explore with you, Tim, we had that list of some of the common tensions that we experience. And as I was looking at that list, I'm thinking, check, check, yes, 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 check. There's got to be a way to identify the one that is your crux tension. And you talked about the mountain climbing example. Like, how do we go about identifying what our crux tension is or are?
There's, and I don't want to overcomplicate this. I would say there's usually one or two crux tensions that are always, they are just in the nature of your organization. You know, I talked about the UN, decentralized freedom, but centralized coordination. Well, that will always be there. I ran a 40-bed residential homeless shelter for a number of years. You know, we recognized probably within the first month that our crux tension was unconditional acceptance, which means I don't care what you've done, what you do, what you'll do in the future, you will always be accepted. And that has to be held in tension with accountability, consequences. And if we don't hold in tension accountability and acceptance, we'll never care for each other. Yeah. Those ones surface pretty quick because it feels like they're the things you're always talking about. If there's something that divides your team in an ongoing way, it's always that thing. Yeah. So, you know, and again, I think a good way to do it is take my list of 10, or again, in the book, there's a list of 25. Yeah. Throw it to your team and say, let's meet next week. What are the 3 that you think are make it or break it for us? You will have some variety, but the themes will be super clear. Yeah. There's also, so that's, and what I would say is every organization will be able to break through levels of effectiveness if they can name that short list of 1 to 3 crux tensions and just make that a safe conversation. It's a language we all share. Yeah. It's something that we orient people on. There also is, and it wouldn't be necessarily a crux tension. It's almost like it's a seasonal tension to keep your eye on right now. So it's not like we have to worry about this forever. Yeah. But as I said, right now, for example, in COVID, when everyone's talking about pivoting and changing and evolving, everything in me is saying, I hope people recognize that change and stability are a tension to manage. Yeah. And if all you do is pivot and change and evolve without holding on to those core values and what you're known for and being an expert at something, it's as futile or as dangerous as inhaling and holding it. It just won't work long term. Yeah. So in any season, and you were talking about your strategic planning session, it's almost a conversation to say, okay, gang, are there any tensions right now that we just really have to be mindful of? Yeah. You know, that we really need to, you know, I doing some work right now with a lot of leaders in retirement and long-term care. And, you know, right now, the one that they're all dealing with is how on earth do we take care of ourselves when every waking hour is taking care of other people? Yeah. You know, and we know that if I don't take care of myself, I'm never good to anyone, but I honestly don't know how to manage it right now. So we're saying, okay, for now, this is a tension that we're going to be vigilant to manage. And the nice thing, and I didn't mention this earlier, it doesn't have to be 50-50. You know, how you manage in your organization change and stability could look very different than how we are. You know, and if I work for maybe Revenue Canada, they're probably very weighted on stability. You know, if I'm dealing with a tech startup, it's probably weighted heavily on change. It's not about proportions. It's, are we getting the values of both sides? Yeah. You know, structure and flexibility with my kids. It's not about meeting in the middle. It's, are we getting the values of structure and the values of flexibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably a good time to remind people that may have joined a little bit late, that don't like to tune in for my intro, but just want to get to the heart of the speaker. Yeah, I don't blame you. We are giving away copies of Tim's book, and there's 2 ways to win. Fill out the feedback form when the show is over. The second way is a lot more fun, is to recognize somebody that has made a difference in your life and recognize them publicly on social media, tag them if they have an account, mention them by name if they don't, and use the hashtag Results Unleashed. And for every post that you make, you will get an entry into the draw to win Tim's book. Tim is also offering up a really, really impactful workshop to folks that want to take this back to their teams and get a little bit more intentional about working this. So thank you for that, Tim. Now, you hit on one of the pandemic-related tensions that we're seeing, the care for others versus care of self. Another one that you and I spoke about was being truthful versus being tactful. And I thought that was a really, really interesting one. Could you maybe explain how you see that one show up right now? And then how do we stay true to our core values and manage that kind of a tension?
Yeah, and truth and tact, or sometimes that's referred to as like being candid and clear at the same time being, diplomatic and relational. Every leader manages that tension every day. Every email I write, every presentation I give, I have to be truthful and tactful. What's interesting is most people, the vast majority of people, lean one side over the other. And that's fine. I mean, I lean pretty hard on the truth candor side. My coworker, Claudia, is very strong on the diplomatic relational side. It's not about changing who you are or your bias, but it's about what's called embracing your opposite. So, what would be easy is, Jeff, if you're also kind of a candor truth person and we're together, and like you, I write hundreds of emails a day, but we all write that one email where we're like, what, this one matters. So I'm like, as a truth kind of candid person, I better have one other person read it, because sometimes my emails don't go the way I think they will. But because, again, I said earlier, that confirmation bias, we got to look for things to affirm our point of view. Instead of going to Claudia, who sees things from the other side, I go to you. So I'm like, Jeff and I, we just work so well together. We click. You look at my email and you're like, Tim, well done. Really effective. So I send it, and the next day we both can't believe how those people took it, as opposed to saying, you know what, I don't really need Jeff to read my emails because we're already on the same side. I need Claudia to read my emails.
Yeah.
And that email, and I mean, the interesting thing, I talk in the book about going slow to go fast. If I took 5 minutes to get Claudia to read that email, it may have saved me 5 hours of cleanup meetings I never had to have.
Yeah.
And the idea is the best way that you manage tensions in a team setting isn't by changing who you are. Embrace your biases, embrace your point of views, but also embrace your opposite. And, I'm Canadian. Canada does tolerance well. We like tolerance. Tolerance doesn't cut it here. Embrace literally means to hug. It means I need your perspective. And, if you're in a team setting, you've identified that crux tension. I'd say, okay, also say, where do we lean and how are we embracing that other side? Not to give up. And maybe, I know time is ticking here. Something to be thinking about as we start to land the plane. Problem solving makes us think that if I embrace my opposite, I have to give up what I care about. We're not talking about exchanging my point of view for the other. We're talking about expanding. And I'm going to hold on to my values, and I'm going to expand to integrate a perspective that makes it even stronger.
Yeah.
And we're not leaving here to go there. In organizations, we often make that pendulum swing mistake. Well, change isn't working, so we're going to be stable. Well, no. How do we hold on to what's working about change and integrate the foundations of values and stability?
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam Grant actually talks a lot about, oftentimes we insulate ourselves. So we think that our network is the people that prop us up and support us and pat us on the back. And he's pretty adamant to say that it's just as important to have what he calls a challenge network. And it's like, okay, that's hard to do. But anytime somebody gives me feedback that's different to what I would normally, or has a view that's different than mine, or says, Jeff, did you know this is a bit of a blind spot for you? I hate that moment, but I love what happens after. And so it takes a ton of courage, but I just couldn't agree more with what you're saying right now.
Well, and I actually think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think Grant uses the term, we want cheerleaders, but we need challengers. Yeah. And again, intuitively, I think we want that pat on the back, but great, that makes us feel good. It doesn't help us. What we need is that, and again, it has to come from, and the teams that I've worked in and with that just outperform anyone around them. Again, instead of having these meetings where everyone nods their head and, is polite, but then after the meeting, the real meeting happens. And that's when I find people who share my point of view and we really have it. No, the opposite. They say, no, let's bring it to the table. Let's bring it to the Zoom call. I know that people have lots of different opinions and are all over the spectrum. Let's actually lean into that so we can make informed decisions, so that we're seeing not just my truth, but the whole truth.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. The pandemic has brought something different for everyone. I'm wondering, Tim, from your perspective, what are some of the silver linings that you've seen throughout the last 4 months from people, things that have surprised you, caught your attention, anything in those sort of buckets that you'd want to share with us?
Yeah, maybe I'll just speak personally. I mean, I can anecdotally talk about things, but I would say a few things for me. I think there's a few tensions that, as the author of the book, Healthy Tension, I thought were okay and I recognize can be a lot more healthy. One for me is the tension between expectations and grace. I do the expectations side really well. I have high expectations on myself. I have high expectations on others. I don't do the grace side as well. And what I've learned and I'm learning in these last few months is that expectations without grace, first of all, make me a pretty unhappy person, and make me a person that other people don't want to work with. And I don't have to give up expectations to integrate grace and understanding and unconditional acceptance. Actually, it actually allows me to have higher expectations. So I've known that tension existed. I've experienced it at a whole new level. And I think just another one, one of the tensions every single person manages all the time is work and home. And, this pandemic has kind of disrupted it completely. So however you were managing it 3 months ago probably looks different now. And in some ways, I think it's given us the opportunity to say, well, what does healthy work home look like? And not as a formula of I'm done at 5 but like, what are the values of work that I don't want to let go of, whether I'm home or in an office? Also, what am I learning are some values of home that I just really want to embrace right now? And I think it's given us the opportunity to stand back and kind of assess how healthy was it. And not that I have a total do-over, but I got an opportunity right now to manage this tension in a new way. So let's stop using language like back to normal and start thinking about what's the new normal and what am I going to do to make sure that that's something I'm feeling pretty proud of.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That grace part really hits me. I feel that. What's your hope for the future of leadership? I mean, you make a big impact on people's lives, Tim. What are you seeing out there, and what's your wish and your hope for leadership?
Again, it's very much a realistic, optimistic tension to manage, because right now I feel like it'd be easy to say, wow, our world is getting more polarized. We're playing into, the tricks of social media and news sources that, are forcing us to pick a side. And I do think that that's real to some level. I do believe, though, similar to inhaling and holding it, there's a point where you have to exhale. And I believe right now, and I'm seeing it most in organizations with the younger generation, they're just recognizing this isn't working. This pick a side, find your camp, hang out, it's just not working. Whether you're talking politics, whether you're talking about, workplace culture, I believe, and maybe I'm looking for it, but I believe that more and more people are just not okay with the way things are right now, and are actually going to force, maybe the older generations, I don't know where I fall in that, but to get away from either or thinking and just say, gang, it's time to embrace this and thinking. Again, whether they use that language or even grasp what we're talking about, they're living it. They're saying this is not okay. Generations ago, it was it was a generation that deconstructed the boomers kind of Canadian or American dream. It's like, that's not the dream. And they disrupted that on a lot of levels. I think right now, there's a rising that's happening to say this whole like either or political world and either or social world, it's not working. And I do believe that it's going to change.
Yeah.
I also think people who want to be on the forefront of that, it takes courage. And I think you're going to be able to look back and say, wow, I was able to be part of that movement.
Yeah.
Definitely help my organization, help maybe my leadership, but I actually think the world right now needs more leaders that can live in that both and space.
Yeah, that's very well said, Tim. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I just want to thank you for the meaningful work that you do. And when we launched this series, we said it needed to do two things: teach people something new, or make people look at something familiar with a completely different perspective. And I think I can confidently say you've done both of those things today, Tim. And this brings us to the close of our final episode of season one. And I would be remiss if I didn't do a little bit of reflection and retrospection here. And I want to thank our entire team. 4 months ago when the pandemic hit, we jumped on a call at 8 a.m. as an entire team spread out across Western Canada. And we were reeling, and we shared our emotions. We shared our thoughts, our ideas, our opinions. We talked about the things that scared us the most, the things that we were fearful about. And we had no idea what this impact was going to be on the world, on people, on our business, on our careers, on our livelihoods. And every single one of our people stepped up, and they have been so courageous. They have been so strong. They have given of themselves to anybody that can use their help and their guidance. And I just can't think of a better place that I could have ever hoped to have been than with this group of people. And by extension of that, Tim, we generated a bunch of ideas. This was one of them. And the ideas are only as good as the people that decide to jump on board with them. And so for every single person that has tuned in, the audience, whether you saw 5 minutes or you saw 15 hours of content, thank you so much. You've spread the word. You've joined us. You've propped us up. You've given us confidence. And if we didn't have speakers like Tim Arnold, we wouldn't have much to talk about. So we'd have lots to talk about. I don't know if anybody would show up. But Tim, you've helped to make and fortify season one as a huge success by every metric. So thank you so much for your dedication to what you do and sharing a snippet of that with us today. So let's stay connected. We're taking a break for the summer. We'll be back for season 2 on September 10th. We've already been booking some really interesting thought leaders and speakers and authors. You can follow us follow Tim on Twitter and us, but follow Tim on Twitter at TimArnold1. And you can email us anytime at info@unleashedresults.com. Tim's got a great website, leadersforleaders.ca. What a great URL. Fill out the feedback survey as well. So when you leave the meeting, click the leave meeting button. And then, of course, click the continue button to fill out the important feedback. We're also offering up, so if you're going to train yourself up during the summer, we've got a 4-part Leaders Toolkit workshop that we're offering. It's 4 2-hour workshops on some of the fundamentals of being a really effective leader: cultural chemistry, culture of accountability, running effective meetings in person and virtually, and then giving and receiving feedback. And we're offering that, of course, at a special price right now, just based on current situations. And then Tim has got a really awesome workshop called Leaders for Leaders, a virtual team building and leadership development opportunity here, talking about leadership resiliency, building a high-performing team. He inserts the EQ edge, and then he's able to customize the training, and you can actually choose from 18 modules within these pillars. And he'll deliver an interactive workshop, a private workshop, that allows your team to actually dive into some of the topics that we explored today, so you can apply those to your leadership capabilities on a go-forward basis. And it's really life-changing, not just for business, but for your personal life. And as we mentioned, stay tuned. So I'm very proud to see that roster of speakers there. We'll be back in September. We'll be here before we know it, and lots will change between now and then. But the one thing that will remain constant is we'll always be here for humble, ambitious, open-minded leaders that have a growth mindset. And as long as you think we're useful, we're going to keep putting content out there that we think will be useful for you. So be well, everybody. Take care. Don't forget to mention someone that made a difference on your life on social media for a chance to win Tim's book. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, gang.